let me just start by saying, well, I hope some people, some Curb Your Enthusiasm enthusiasts might recognize the reference in our title, Managing Without Managing. And if you don't, then you might recognize it from a paper written about 3 decades ago from a guy called Ricardo Semler, who's CEO of a Brazilian conglomerate called Semco, about whom I'm going to talk today, in fact. They've been for 3 decades experimenting in self-governance, self-management with great success, I might add. Where we're coming from in this paper is, we know from my personal research in human relations and organizational behavior, but also research done more recently in business ethics, we know, and we're told, that workplace democracy, broadly defined, giving workers a say over their work, boosts their fulfillment, boosts their satisfaction, increases their motivation. And from an ethical or moral point of view, it's simply the right thing to do. We know that, you know, that's a sort of stuff going back to the 1920s shows that. Our paper that we did, Lars and I and a PhD student from Cisco Systems, we provide an additional proof point from that, an additional sort of point of evidence. And we're saying that this sort of form of workplace democracy is not just critical for worker satisfaction, but it's also really critical potentially for organizations and their leaders, the types of changes they may have to make for adaptation or survival in increasingly, let's say, rugged landscapes, increasingly turbulent, rapidly changing landscapes. And we had a hunch, an intuition, if you will, myself as an evolutionary economist, as an org theorist, and Lars as a design thinker and consumer behavior researcher, we shared this hunch or this intuition that business models and the organizations that house them were changing by themselves. They were changing spontaneously and autonomously from top management in response to changes in the external environment. So we wanted a place to test this hypothesis, if you will. So luckily we were jointly supervising a PhD student, a senior manager from Cisco Systems. We knew that Cisco Systems was an organization in an environment characterized by profound technological and market uncertainty, continuous and rapid change. And we knew that senior managers couldn't be omnipresent. They couldn't be always and everywhere. So we had this hunch that presented this theoretical anomaly. So that the static, let's say, textbook model on organization, strategy, business models couldn't explain this spontaneous change in business models and in organizations themselves. And we realized this because these textbook models, I suppose, are closed systems models. So they're based on stable linear systems, where the only change comes from outside, from exogenous shocks. And the only changes to, say, business strategy and business models reflect rational managerial choices. And in this context, there's no real scope for novelty. And so these types of models or frameworks were simply unable to handle what was going on at Cisco, what we were observing at Cisco. We turned to complexity theory because we believed that complexity theory would be better able to explain how Cisco's business models evolved in practice. In the simplest possible terms, that's possible with complexity theory, complex systems are composed of a diversity of agents, and they're interacting. And during these interactions, they mutually affect one another, change one another. And this causes what we call localized learning. And this localized learning and these mutual interactions and feedback mechanisms, this generates novelty. This generates novel behavior for the system as a whole. So these agents change and the system itself changes. But the two key characteristics for our purposes are emergence and self-organization. So within complex systems, structure emerges within the system that's totally independent from the actions of any specific or any one agent, and yet it's totally reliant on their interactions. And the best examples, some of which you can see on the slide here, are the human brain, natural and social ecosystems, the internet, animal swarms, insect colonies, road traffic systems, and so on. And organizations themselves and the societies and economies within which they're based are also perfect exemplars of living, self-organizing systems. They're both complex and they're self-adaptive because they're composed of actors or agents in motion, each following a small number of, let's say, simple rules. And these agents or actors in motion following these simple rules spontaneously self-organize into something complex and something unexpected. For instance, and just like ants, soldier ants emerging from an ant's nest in search of food, organizations or consumers discover what other organizations and other consumers are doing. They choose how to respond and they change their behavior accordingly. These changes have consequences which other organizations and other consumers discover. This then causes a response, which is discovered, which causes another response, and so on. That's the essence of how these things work. So what are the consequences or implications of this? Well, before we drill down to specifics, let's just look at the broad implications. The first of which is that planning for and trying to forecast and project an unknowable future is elusive, it's problematic, and this is the one that makes managers most sort of unnerved. Okay, second, survival in these types of environments requires that significant decision-making power be pushed out to what we call the operational and cultural peripheries of organizations. So that's where lots of action's going to take place. I'll explain that in a minute. The third broad implication is that the best managers can actually do is influence what might happen. Okay, by shaping or creating contexts or boundary conditions in which self-organizing forms can occur. So that's order within disorder. Create some simple boundary rules, simple rules within which let chaos reign supreme. That's the idea. That's encapsulated actually in this slide with this long queue at the cafeteria at Google headquarters. Okay, they've consciously designed these long queues. They've consciously designed this to almost force agents to interact and affect one another. They know that interactions amongst agents with different types of knowledge, different types of functional expertise, creates novelty. So anything that enhances interactions of agents within organizations, between organizations and their suppliers and customers, that's critical for survival. So to the title of the webinar, Managing Without Managing, what we're proposing, among other things, is reconceptualizing the role of managers from the sort of century and a half idea going back to Henri Fayol, the French org theorist, who said managers were planners, organizers, recruiters, directors, and controllers. In some contexts, in some organizations, there's still a place for this, possibly in militaristic or military organizations, though even there, I believe that self-organization there's a role for self-organization. Okay, we're thinking about changing those roles or rethinking those roles for managers to managers as meaning or sense makers, managers as facilitators, managers as influencers and orchestrators and monitors. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about. And that basically points to three critical changes. The first of which is sort of a higher order change to the purpose and mission of organizations. The second of which is a structural or design change. And the third is a change to the way we think about how strategy is created and executed. And this is encapsulated by what's called the chaotic organization. I'm not going to say much more about the chaotic organization, but as this diagram suggests, it encapsulates this sort of order within disorder idea. We've got chaos, we've got order, and in between that is chaorder or chaotic. And there's emergence, innovation, and creativity. Three critical elements for surviving rapidly changing environments. Okay, so as to the first of these critical reconceptualized roles for managers, managers as sense or meaning makers. A lot of what I'm going to say in a minute is about enabling individuals and groups and teams to pursue learning and innovation. And that results in this self-organizing behavior. But in order to be able to do that, employees need autonomy and discretion. But the sort of paradox here is autonomy and discretion is critical, but we can't let things descend into disorder or chaos, right? It's back to that order within disorder idea. Okay, if one of the sort of structural recommendations is to remove command and control and order giving and top-down management, there must be something that coordinates and unites these independent actors and their efforts towards organizational goals. And this is where shared values and norms come in. This is where a sense of shared meaning comes in. And as I said, at the higher order at least, a shared, purpose is critical. And purpose is a very topical area. There's been a webinar on this that we've presented, I believe. So purpose is critical, and managers as sense makers and meaning makers, this is where they come in and say, this is what we're doing, and most importantly, this is why we're doing it. Okay, and this collective sense of purpose provides some sort of compelling reason to exert discretionary effort. That's what's needed in these times, in these types of environments. In order to get employees to muck in the types of self-organizing teams and projects that I'm about to talk about, they need to have a compelling reason to do so. So managers have to set the scene, set a sense of, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. Okay. The second role for managers as facilitators, and these are design and structural changes. And you can see the contrast there between traditional hierarchy or pyramid structure versus the circular structure that's encapsulated by holacracy, about which I'll say a bit more in a minute. Okay, so in complex systems like organizations, which themselves are embedded in complex systems such as societies and economies, socio-economic systems, employees need flexibility. They need the leeway to adapt to changing conditions and make the right decisions in the moment. This is what Lars and I were doing in our paper that we published late last year. This is a sort of proof point that we're bringing to bear on this. It's an area of research that's been around for some time, but we're just bringing this new sort of evidence, body of evidence to it, this different way of thinking about it. So employees need this leeway to adapt to changing conditions, and they need to be able to make the right decisions in the moment, on the ground, on the grassroots, at the coalface. And managerial hierarchies, pyramid structures, often don't provide the flexibility or discretion for that to happen. Okay, so the order of the day is delayering and decentralizing. As I said before, pushing out decision-making to the operational and cultural and structural periphery of organizations, outside or down the bottom, as if you will. So work and tasks have to be organized around teams, projects, task forces. And these teams and project groupings have to be flexible enough to form themselves, change themselves, and dissolve themselves as is needed by the demands of the external environment. So this is, in fact, self-organization and self-design without formal coordination and hierarchy that we've seen in natural systems. And one example of this today is this idea of holacracy. And these organizations you can see on the screen here, Semco Partners in the center there, the Brazilian conglomerate I mentioned, Zappos down the bottom, the e-commerce company owned by Amazon, Valve, the video games and software company, Gore, who make Gore-Tex, Spotify, who I'm sure you know, Morningstar, who have pretty much the 40% of US market share in tin tomatoes, of all things, Oticon, the Danish medical equipment company. These are all companies or organizations that have experimented with the idea of holacracy, self-management. So Zappos are a sort of a great example that have been written about. Freed from direct supervision, there are no bosses. Employees are expected to join various temporary democratic assemblies, called circles. These are headed but not run by a lead link. These employees are expected to propose their own job description, what they do. They're supposed to ratify the roles of others. They're supposed to decide what projects the group should undertake, and they're governed loosely by a playbook, a set of rules, a constitution, memoranda of understanding, things of this nature. The idea here is, again, of simple rules. Okay, top managers, right? There's still a role for them somewhere in the place. They might decide what problems to solve, not how to solve them. Even in the US military, there's examples of this. Military commanders are giving self-governed units within the military. These are the problems we want solved. You go and solve them. We're not telling you how to solve them. So traditionally, management has gone wrong when bosses get to prescribe what must be done, and worse still, how it should be done, because of job descriptions, because of positions that people occupy, not because of know-how, not because of particular insights. So this leads us on nicely to the third role, reconceptualized role of managers as orchestrators. Knowledge must rule, as Mary Parker Follett famously said in the 1920s. Power should accrue to those who know. Power should accrue to those who become a source of knowledge by sharing what they know. Nanaka, the Japanese organizational theorist, says that making personal and individual knowledge available to others is the central reason for organizations to exist. He talks about the idea of bar, B-A, a space or context where people freely and openly share what they know in the service of creating something new. So his cycle of knowledge down the bottom here, this Secchi diagram, which many of you might know, he being Nanaka, this perfectly captures what we're talking about here in terms of knowledge creation. So those projects, task forces, small teams we mentioned in the guise of holacracy, they have to be necessarily cross-functional or project-based or matrix-based. And this is how managers as orchestrators can orchestrate interactions amongst people with different types of knowledge, different levels of knowledge, blending different types of functional expertise, as Prahalad and Hamill say in their great article, The Core Competence of the Corporation. Okay, and that's when novelty is created. That's how they define core competence. Blending functional expertise across organizational boundaries. That's what this stuff is essentially talking about. The third, sorry, to continue this role of managers as orchestrators, they're not just structural change, but also cultural change. So for innovation and creativity to emerge, culture has to change. Simple rules, about which I've said a lot, are meant to be broken. Assumptions are continually to be tested. As Ricardo Semler says about SEMCO, this is a form of civil disobedience. And that's a good thing. Yeah, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Common sense must prevail. And this is this type of environment supports experimentation, risk-taking, failure. Trial and error must be viewed as a viable process. And overarching all of this, of course, is the idea of psychological safety. Open and frank discussions require the removal of fear of recrimination, fear of blame. The final reconceptualized role of management or managers is as influencers and monitors. And this type of idea dovetails with work being done in strategic management in a sort of sub-area called strategy as practice. And here what we had in mind is middle managers, especially operational managers, frontline managers, empowered and well-resourced, because these people are not just executors, implementers of strategy, but they're also creators and crafters of strategy. These peripheral strategists, they're typically, as Richard Pascali calls them, positive deviants, people that are questioning the status quo. People on the periphery, these grassroots strategists, tend to be in touch with the marketplace. They're right at the coalface. They see what's happening in markets, and they need to be able to respond to emerging needs and serious challenges as quickly and as unbureaucratically as possible. They need to be empowered and they need to be resourced. In many situations, Intel and Ericsson on the slide are perfect examples. This is where strategy might be coming from. Okay, so Andy Grove candidly admits that Intel's diversification, if you will, their exit out of memory chips and into microprocessors, had nothing to do with the top management team. It was the spontaneous and independent or autonomous actions of operational managers in the field that called the shots there. I'm not making this stuff up, in other words, okay? So this is another emerging role, or a reconceptualized role. Okay, so to answer our question, our overarching question, do we need bosses? No, but yes. We don't need the bosses of old. We don't need, in these types of contexts, we don't need the Henri Fayol idea of bosses as top-down order givers, stifling people's creativity. Okay, we need bosses as facilitators, orchestrators, context creators. Okay, in terms of, so managing is actually more critical than ever, and there's a great article in the additional resources by Foss and Klein that speak to this. Okay, organizations are still in the business of creating valuable goods and services for you and I to buy. Someone still has to bring home the bacon, as it were. Yeah, there's still this idea of coordination and communication. Okay, we're not throwing all that out. In terms of some takeaways, I suppose, some recommendations, if you will. Start small, but start. Do something, do anything. Experiment with new ways of working within projects and expand from there. Start small, but start. In terms of these radical, controversial, cultural changes, if you will, follow a shoulder tap and opt-in approach to initiate change. There's going to be people ready and willing for this. There's going to be some that aren't. And you really need corporate cover or executive support for this stuff. Thirdly, as a leader, it could be a de facto leader, leading a de facto team. Protect that team or project and their new way of working. They have to be protected from the red tape old world of the old way, red tape world of doing things. So we suggest autonomous secret projects, shooting for the stars type scenarios. Fourthly, some Theory X managers, so-called, who believe that workers, employees are inherently lazy and have to be told what to do, when to do it, always and everywhere. Maybe they need to look elsewhere. Employees, this isn't for everybody, right? So some employees who may have an excessively external locus of control, or they may rather focus on satisfying their own ego or satisfying their own boss rather than getting work done. They need to be allowed or encouraged to opt out. Okay, Zappos, for example, offer any unhappy employees $5,000. Okay, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to open the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, to questions.
Thanks very much, Kyle. So we've got a lot of great questions coming through. I hope we've got some time to answer them. We'll do our best. So the first question from Jacqueline: are subcircles usually defined by the employees or the manager? I feel like people traditionally look towards managers for guidance and fail to define tasks or functions themselves.
Well, it depends. It depends on the organisation. It depends on the culture of the organisation. I mean, the examples, the work that I know of, it's what's the old-fashioned term, codetermination. I mean, people, Semco, for example, or even Zappos, these teams, they decide who does what. There's this idea that Semler refers to as spontaneous order. Get a group of 10 to 12 people together, a leader will emerge, a de facto leader will emerge organically, spontaneously. People, because of their different knowledge sets, will kind of gravitate towards what they're good at doing, and they'll realize what they're not good at doing. This one point that I forgot to say, some employees will be uneasy about this. I think that's what Jackie, is getting at. There will be a sense of unease. There will be a sense of unease that traditionally, where we're used to waiting to be told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. But in this type of ideal word scenario, where a bunch of people are mucking in, getting involved in something, they know what the purpose is, they know what the mission is, they believe in it, the job needs to be done. We're gonna muck in, and there's gonna be lots of cross functionality. So you might be doing one thing that you're good at doing, but you may have to do something that you're not good at doing in the interest of meeting a target.
Right. Okay, so a related question then, it's a question from Bill, and your model of holacracy is consistent with that of cooperatives. What have you found in Australia as the most significant cultural barrier or enabler to your implementation of the chaotic organisation? Great question, Bill, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's the question that can't be answered, because we haven't found anything in Australia about this, and it's interesting, we're sort of musing about this last week with some other people, and the second part of the question, the barrier to this, is probably a cultural barrier, and not an organisational cultural barrier, but maybe a national cultural barrier. It's an interesting thing that we as a country, at least stereotypically, sort of gravitate towards, I don't want to say it because it's going to be controversial, but gravitate towards being pliant and we gravitate towards being we come across as not liking being told what to do, but we're pretty good at doing it. And this recent crisis has proven that to the rest of the world. We come across as larrikins and so on and so forth, but when that's the only way I can think about it. There's no real examples, case examples of how or where this is played out in Australia that we're aware of.
Right. So a question from Benjamin then. So thanks, Kyle. Do you think that this concept can apply or not apply to the scenario of transformation or change management? That is, does it allow an aspect of holacracy in a program of work?
I think it's I think it would be a great part of transformational leadership, was it?
Transformational change management.
Yeah, transformational change, I think it would be a great part of it. As I said, this would be sort of a secret sort of project that sort of infects the rest of the organization. A couple of great examples where this we know of, where this has happened in a particular division or a particular plant as a sort of proof point, and then the rest of the organization, other plants and other divisions have found out about this. It's been successful. Outside stakeholders have been happy, and then it's been rolled out throughout the organization. It's actually a really fine way. It's that start small but start idea. It's actually a really fine way of doing this, and doing it secretly is important. It's sort of this snowball strategy, very small changes, and that way, not a lot of people can resist it up front.
Okay, so a lot of questions around remuneration. Sorry. Okay, so in this model, how do you best align remuneration? Good question from Mark, also from Aranita, and also from Sarge. Bonus structures encourage behaviours such as trial, error, aspiration and experimentation that previously employees might have been penalised for. That is, not achieving KPIs equals no bonus. So what are your comments on remuneration related to holacracy?
Yeah, this is the biggest downside of the whole affair. It's the one thing that even Tony Shea, the head of Zappos, has grappled with the most, or had trouble grappling with, I should say, because traditional performance metrics, managing performance, is really tricky. And at the very essence, it's sort of economics 101. You've got individual effort to group, individual contributions to group effort. When everyone's mucking in, as I like to call it, it's hard to measure who's doing what. There's no standard job descriptions, and there's no standard, all these performance metrics are kind of out the window. So there is a scope for shirking, right? There is a scope for loafing. And there is how do you do this? How do you pay the hardest workers? Well, I can only cite the case evidence. So at Semco, if the workers are unionised, then that's a done deal. It's hourly paid rates. For the upper managers, there's still managers there, they decide their own salaries. They decide their own leave. They decide their own description. Seriously, it's self-determination at the most extreme level. And that won't be for everybody. We keep emphasising this. So that's one thing. So traditional performance metrics, remuneration, that's a really tricky area, especially if it's like, I'm worth this much. So if an employee overestimates what they say they're worth, they let them get away with it for a time. If they underestimate what they're worth, they let them get away with that for a time, but then they compensate either way. The other thing, by the way, is it also potentially breeds nepotism. Yeah, so connections are really important as well. Connections through family or informal connections are also another downside in this scenario.
Right, and just time for our last question, which is from Arash. In absence of control that we talked about, how do organisations control risk like fraud in employees or minimise, the risk mitigation against them demanded by law, or who will be accountable to shareholders without this control?
See, it's not absence of control. It's not absence of control. It's absence of formal control, informal rules, institutions such as norms, values, they're still they're still coordinating what people do and what people don't do. It's interesting what you said, Arash, about the law. Semco used to have bag checks at the end of each shift in their manufacturing plants because employees were stealing stuff, and they did away with that. And guess what? Theft went down. Now, in terms of the other side, so this is the thing. A bunch of people being treated as if they are adults, having a say about decisions that affect them, like what happens outside of organisations in democracies. Why does that stop at the door of organisations? This is the point I should have started with. It's just a crazy situation. So people being treated as adults, having some say over decisions that affect them is a democratic right. People behave differently as a consequence. They don't steal. They tend not to overpay themselves. They tend not to take ridiculously long holidays and things like this. This is what the evidence shows. As to the other stuff about obligations to shareholders and stuff, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure about. I just don't know the answer to that. Okay,
well, we've had a lot of great questions. Thank you, everybody, for sending those through. We really appreciate some great discussion here. Kyle, I'll hand back to you just to summarise for today.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got so much more to say. I've probably left off about half the things I meant to say. But look, as I said, this just on the last point, this is an old idea, and this is just one idea. This idea of managing without managing is just one part of what Lars and I wanted to say and do today. We just wanted to bring another perspective to this. This is a sensible thing to do from an org behaviour, human relations perspective. It's a sensible thing to do from a moral or ethical perspective, but it's also a sensible thing to do from a strategic perspective. That's what we wanted to say today. However, it's not easy. It's not for everyone. It's not for every organisation. As the questioner, the national cultural impediments might get in the way as well. So that's all we wanted to get across today, is this additional proof point, this additional piece of evidence for, in these times, traditional ways of managing may have to be rethought.
Great summary. All right, I'd now like to hand back to Tony to close. Thanks, Tony.
Our follow-up email will include a link to the recording of today's webinar and also some resources that will allow you to further explore this topic. Macquarie Business School offers a range of short courses on general management and leadership, both virtual and face-to-face, and the contact details, should you be interested, are on the screen now. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. There are a lot of great questions on the Q&A function, so thank you very much for those. And thank you again to Kyle. And so with that, we'd like to say, keep your eye out for future webinars and short courses that are offered by Macquarie Business School. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kyle and Tony. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you then. Cheers.